You are about to listen to the full interview with Patrick Boyton. Sections of it were originally included in our Snallygaster episode. Patrick Boyton is the author of Snallygaster, the lost legend of Frederick County. We dig deeper into the history of the Snallygaster, including stories we didn't have time for in the episode. We hope you enjoy.
My name is Patrick Boyton. I grew up in New Jersey, but I've lived in Frederick County, Maryland since 2006. Many people who live here consider it Western Maryland, but that's kind of a geographical misnomer. It's more like Northern Central Maryland. And my full-time job is I'm a civil servant for the federal government, but I've always enjoyed writing and researching local history, and that's how I spend my spare time. Sure. So my first introduction to the Snallygaster was soon after my wife and I moved to Maryland. We were out at a local brewery, and one of the local beers was called the Snallygaster, and it was on the board, up above, and it struck me as a kind of a funny name. So I asked the waiter about it, and lucky for us, the waiter was a native to the Frederick area, and he was able to give me the whole origin about the local legend. I was kind of hooked from there. Sure. The way the Snallygaster was described to me at first was this winged dragon-like creature, and right away it made me think of the Jersey Devil, which was a myth that I had grown up hearing about in New Jersey. So I went online to look for information about the Snallygaster, and there was really not a lot out there. This was around 2006. And there just wasn't a whole lot of information about the Snallygaster online. So I went to our county library, and they have an excellent local history section and a really knowledgeable staff. And I started going through old newspaper articles. Everything was on microfilm, so it was very cinematic. I was kind of like scrolling through these old microfiche. It was very kind of Silence of the Lambs. So before I knew it, I gathered a stack of research, and my wife recommended that I write a book on it, and that's how it started. It was my first book. I had not. I'd done writing, read short stories and such, made some short films, but I'd never written a book before. I did. Mm-hmm. Yep, that one's called Beware the Snallygaster, and it's a chapter book for 8 to 10, 11-year-olds, and it follows the adventures of two local kids trying to seek out the Snallygaster. I have not, no. It's a good idea. I hope somebody does it. The first settlers in Frederick and Washington counties were the Pennsylvania Dutch, who migrated south from southeastern and south central Pennsylvania in the late 18th century. And Frederick was an important stop on their migration route as they came down from Gettysburg and continued south through Winchester and Roanoke, Virginia. So the Pennsylvania Dutch sounds like they should be immigrants from the Netherlands, but they're actually, German settlers, and the name Dutch in this case is from Deutsch, which of course means German. So some folks think that the Pennsylvania Dutch are actually Dutch, but they're German. According to Alice Weinberg's book, Spirits of Frederick, tales of the Snallygaster go back to the earliest German settlers in about 1735, but there's nothing really recorded until nearly a century and a half after that. Well, based on my research, the Snallygaster in its description as a flying winged creature probably comes close to dragon folklore. And of course, there's a lot of dragon folklore in Germany. But in 1876, there was a widow from Washington society. Her name was Madeline Dahlgren. and she purchased an old inn on South Mountain in Washington County, and that neighbors Frederick County. And she turned her residence, well, she turned the inn into her private residence, her summer residence. So she was a writer, and she had started collecting folklore and legends from the locals who lived on the mountain. And she published these legends in a book called South Mountain Magic. It's a great book. It's still in print, by the way, and it's filled with all these crazy stories about like werewolves and hoop snakes. Hoop snakes are these snakes that move by biting their own tail and rolling around like a tire. So they're really crazy and just really, really great stories. And she doesn't mention the word Snallygaster in South Mountain Magic, but Madeline Dahlgren does talk a lot about ghost stories and poltergeists. And in my early research, I discovered that Snallygaster may be a mispronunciation of Schnallgeister, which is itself a corruption of the German term Schnallgeist, or quick spirit. So in the Pennsylvania Dutch traditions, a quick spirit is responsible for things being knocked off shelves and moving around, sort of like a poltergeist we would think of. So the Snallygaster actually could have started out as a ghost story. So Snallygaster might be an amalgam of traditional ghost story and dragon lore. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Sure. Around 1909, when it first started appearing in the local newspaper, it was described as a winged dragon-like creature. In addition to its wings, it was described as having a needle-like beak and four legs armed with steel claws, like hooks, and a single eye in the middle of its forehead. And it was also reported to emit a screech like a locomotive whistle. Sure. The original run of the Snallygaster stories in 1909 began on February 12th of that year, of 1909. It appeared in the Middletown Valley Register, which was a local newspaper. Snallygaster was spotted by a man named Bill Gifferson, who was walking along a country road one evening when a winged beast swooped down from the night sky and snatched him up, pierced his neck with its beak, and tossed his lifeless body over a cliff. So I'm not sure if Mr. Gifferson counts as an eyewitness because he didn't live to tell the tale, but that's the first recorded Snallygaster victim and the first time the Snallygaster appears in the newspaper. And following the initial story, there were a series of articles that appeared in the Register and surrounding papers about additional sightings in the area. There was a man named George Jacobs, who was hunting the Snallygaster. And when the beast came down from the sky and Jacobs shot at it, but apparently the bullet rattled off its hide as if hitting an iron plate. And the man narrowly escaped into a barn. So it was a happier ending for him than Bill Gifferson, for sure. I don't. I don't know who told the story of Bill Gifferson for the first time. I think it's kind of interesting that the first Snallygaster story has no eyewitnesses, right? It makes it kind of funny in a way. I always found that kind of, it wasn't lost on me when I was researching it. I always kind of found it amusing. I did do some research to see if there was an actual Bill Gifferson, and I was unable to find anything in the records. Now, some of the names, particularly the publisher and the writer associated at the paper at the time, were real individuals. But Bill Gifferson and some of the other eyewitnesses were not names I was able to find. Well, when I started researching the Snallygaster, I had reread an old book I had on the Jersey Devil, and as I had mentioned earlier, I realized that there were these parallels between the Snallygaster and the New Jersey Devil, and I had, heard stories about the New Jersey Devil growing up. So I went back to an old book I had on the Jersey Devil, and there was a big rash of sightings, and lo and behold, they happened just weeks before the Snallygaster stories started to emerge. But the similarities didn't end there. They both shared similar physical characteristics as far as having wings and talons. They were both referred to as jabberwocks, which of course comes from the Lewis Carroll poem about a fierce creature. So if you're inclined to believe the stories, you can surmise that the Jersey Devil traveled south and is the same creature as the Snallygaster. Certainly a lot of people have come to that conclusion. Or you could, come to the conclusion that the Valley Register publishers ripped off the story from the New Jersey papers. And I don't stress that connection too much because nobody likes to think of their hometown monster as being a knockoff of another monster. Sure. From the 1909 era, to me, the most interesting Snallygaster story is the connection that it had with President Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was in his last weeks of office, and when the Snallygaster stories made their way down to D.C., there were reports that the Smithsonian Institution wanted to capture it alive. So it didn't take long before President Roosevelt himself expressed interest in hunting down the beast. Of course, Teddy was already known for his big game prowess, so it would have made perfect sense to readers at the time. So Roosevelt, as I mentioned, was in the last weeks of his presidency, and he was planning a trip to Africa to hunt big game. And his African safari dominated the papers, so it was big news, much more interesting than the incoming president-elect Taft, which nobody seemed real excited about. Everybody loved Teddy Roosevelt, and I think the papers wanted to continue talking about him even as he was getting ready to leave office. So I love the idea of Teddy Roosevelt hunting the Snallygaster because he's already a mythic figure in his own right. So it really captures that turn of the century America to have these two legends kind of battling it out. But I don't think it ever happened. I think either Teddy Roosevelt was making light of the Snallygaster stories. There's a possibility, he had heard the Snallygaster stories, or there's another possibility that Teddy Roosevelt had not heard about the Snallygaster and that the papers were kind of capitalizing on Teddy's popularity and injected, him into the Snallygaster story, which really makes perfect sense, as I mentioned, because he was a famous hunter even at the time. So an interesting aside is a lot of the animal specimens at the Smithsonian Institution today were ones killed by Teddy Roosevelt on that African trip that he took after leaving office. Yeah, I couldn't find any direct quotes that Teddy Roosevelt had commented on the Snallygaster, and I couldn't really find too many stories from the D.C. papers. It was quoted, from the local papers, from the Middletown Valley Register and the Frederick paper that he was involved. So it's probably pretty unlikely that it was something that he knew about or seriously considered. But like I said, I don't want to ruin anybody's fun. It's a fun story and it's fun to think about, but I don't see any historical evidence for that actually taking place. It was in the 1909 that Snallygaster met its match in the form of a group of men from Emmitsburg, Maryland. which is in the northern part of the county, Frederick County. And there was a railway worker named Ed Brown, and he was sitting outside the Emmitsburg Railroad Station when he heard a noise around back. Now, he believed that this was a coal thief because in the winter months, coal theft was actually one of the most common crimes committed in rural Maryland. So he went around back, and sure enough, he found that he was 16 pieces of coal short. And he was about to go get the authorities when the Snallygaster swooped down and grabbed him, picked him up by his suspenders, started to fly off. Now, lucky for Brown, his buddy Dan Snyder pulled up in his automobile. So Dan Snyder grabbed Mr. Brown by his ankles and was pulling him down. So there was this tug of war as Snallygaster was trying to fly off. And he finally was able to pull Mr. Brown down and free him. And then the two of them ran off, they ran and chased the Snallygaster off into the woods. And at some point, there was a deputy game warden who showed up, flashed his badge, and then ordered the Snallygaster from the county. So I guess the Snallygaster was law-abiding because he flew off and he wasn't heard from again for another 23 years. Yes. These stories were captured, mostly taken from the Middletown Valley Register. Well, the Middletown Valley Register was a daily paper that served the Middletown Valley of Washington County. It started in 1856, I believe, and actually operated until 1990 when it became a weekly paper, and then it turned into the Middletown Citizen, which is still in print. Sure. The Middletown Valley Register's publisher, or the editor of the Middletown Valley Register, was a gentleman named George C. Roderick, and Ralph Wolfe was the writer. So Wolfe did most of the writings of these articles, and Roderick was the editor at the time. And they were both, real members of the community, and they actually did run that paper for that period. To my knowledge, Roderick and Wolfe never came out to admit that they had created any sort of hoax. But I think it's important to point out that hoax stories were very prominent up until a few years following turn of the century there. From the end of the Civil War through the early 1990s, newspaper readership rose from 10 to 26% of the population, and this reflected the illiteracy rate, which had dropped from 20% to 10%. So this was due to an increasing population and urbanization. And suddenly there was this huge demand for newspaper content, and papers would often make up and spread crazy stories to stand out in a crowded marketplace. And these weren't just for ideological or political slants, although there was certainly that. But a lot of these were just really nutty, off-the-wall stories just to get attention. Before becoming a famous author, Mark Twain wrote a story about a man who murdered his wife and ran through the streets with her scalp and his own throat cut. And there was another story about a man who had crossed the Atlantic in a hot air balloon. And this was written 100 years before it actually happened. And the writer of that story was Edgar Allan Poe. So this was pretty popular at the time. Entering the 20th century, there was a turn toward journalistic integrity as readers became more sophisticated. But a lot of the smaller papers, like the Valley Register, continued to run and reprint these hoax stories. The first victim of the Snallygaster, Bill Gifferson, was reported to be an African-American man. And there were references in the articles that the Snallygaster preyed on black people. And a book about the Maryland history published in 1940 echoed this sentiment and described the Snallygaster as being a reptilian bird of vast size that preys on black children. And being that this was Jim Crow era South, when I was doing my research, I just assumed that these references reflected as sort of general racism that was prevalent at the time and place. But while this was certainly the case, the connection of the Snallygaster to the African American community appeared to have been more pointed in its political targeting. In a follow-up article, another African American resident was quoted as saying he wasn't scared of running across the Snallygaster. The only devil he was worried about was the Democratic amendment next fall. So I started researching this, and the amendment in question was the Strauss Amendment, which was a Democratic proposal that intended to restrict the voting rights of African Americans. And Democrats controlled Maryland government on a white supremacist platform in the early 1900s. And reading the editorials and coverage of the Valley Register, it was clear that the paper's publishers held a Republican position, and Middletown was and is still to this day a strong Republican stronghold. So I believe that Roderick and Wolf were using these Snallygaster stories in part to troll Democrats in a way and put a spotlight on the concerns of voter suppression in the African American community. And it seems to have worked, because the Strauss Amendment was one of 3 attempts to amend the state constitution to suppress the black vote, and all 3 were defeated by referendum. That's really hard to say. There is a belief that that's what they were doing, but there's also a sense in reading the peripheral editorials and articles in the paper that were coming out at the same time, that there was this issue of voter suppression, and that this was an issue that they were concerned about. And so there would be these editorials that the paper would run side by side next to the Snallygaster stories. And the editorials, would talk about, challenging African American voter suppression, voter rights, and so forth. And that happened later on. We can discuss that, but it really reading these Snallygaster stories in the context of the newspapers themselves, through the microfilm, as opposed to an article that's been cited, really contextualizes. I feel it really contextualizes the stories and really frames it and helps you understand the political climate, maybe the political sensibilities and biases of the paper at the time. And I started to really kind of get a sense as to what they were trying to do with these stories. Because when I first started reading them, I had no idea, that there was this kind of racist underlying theme, running through the Snallygaster stories. And it took a lot of digging to really put that in context and really kind of begin to understand what that was. Sure. The Snallygaster actually came back about 23 years later on November 11th, 1932. A number of people had claimed to have seen this giant winged one-eyed creature flying over the South Mountain region, and it was determined to be the same Snallygaster that had visited the region in 1909. And this time the creature was said to change colors and throw out long tentacles like an octopus. If you see the cover of my first book, Snallygaster, The Lost Legend of Frederick County, the illustration on the book cover is like the 1932 era Snallygaster with the tentacles, kind of coming out of its mouth. So that those tentacles hadn't really been part of its description in the 1909 stories. There was, yes. Yeah, there was a photograph, alleged, and it's kind of neat to look at that in the microfilm. I believe I have a copy of that in the book, and it's just a sort of grainy image of a flying winged creature. It's just sort of like kind of bad 1932 Photoshop. I don't. No, I don't have any history on that. I imagine the photograph was something that was created and manipulated for the Middletown Valley Register. It, yes, it was actually 1932. So it was a 23-year difference between 1932 and 1909. Yep. There was a reemergence. I can talk a little bit about the 1932 stories, because those are really the two main eras are 1909 and then 1932. And then there are these kind of sporadic reemergences where it sporadically reemerges again here and there through the years. But sure. Yeah. So stories of the Snallygaster in the 1932 run get less fanciful and significantly more frightening than in the 1909 run. And the city of Frederick is the county seat of Frederick County. And even then, it was much different than the rest of the county where the Snallygaster stories had originated. Frederick had factories and shops and row houses. So when reports of the Snallygaster came to the city of Frederick, it took on a much more of like an urban legend flair. Instead of flying over farmland and swooping down to eat chickens, the Snallygaster was seen scaling fences and peering through bedroom windows. It was much more threatening and menacing, more akin to something we'd see in a modern horror movie. Apparently, in 1932, the Snallygaster died from alcohol. He was attracted to fumes from a moonshine still out in the woods of Washington County, and I guess he flew too close and was overcome by the fumes, and then fell into this 2,500-gallon vat of boiling moonshine. And of course, the moonshiners that were attending the illicit still fled into the woods, and by the time their prohibition officers arrived on the scene, the mash had eaten away at the monster's skin and muscles, leaving nothing but skeletal remains. So just to be sure, they put 500 pounds of dynamite under the vat and blew it up. Yes, that story was recounted. That story was recounted in the Middletown Valley Register. That's the story that had the big Snallygaster alleged photograph, and it also had a photograph of the officers, the prohibition officers standing there with their rifles and standing over the still, and it was quite something. So what motivated that was prohibition that was going on in the country at the time. So yes, I think that the local newspaper, the Middletown Valley Register, which was very pro-prohibition, was using these stories of the Snallygaster being attracted to moonshine stills as a way to, it was used as a way to scare off the moonshiners, and it was also a way to get in their political shots as being pro-temperance, anti-alcohol. So it's just as Jim Crow voter suppression was a big issue in 1909, the important issue in 1932 was prohibition. So during the Democratic National Convention of that year, candidate Franklin Roosevelt declared war on prohibition. Americans were eager to get their legal drink back on, and Roosevelt was, eager to make that happen, and he won by a landslide. And 10 days after he won the presidential election, the Valley Register started running the Snallygaster stories again. So there's a real connection there between Franklin Roosevelt's election and the reemergence of the Snallygaster story. So the Valley Register publishers at the time, these two gentlemen named Charles Maine and Edward Leiter, they were big supporters of upholding prohibition, and they feared that a repeal of the Valley Register publishers, Charles Maine and Edward Leiter, they were big supporters of upholding prohibition. So they feared that a repeal of the 18th Amendment wasn't far behind, which of course it wasn't, and the paper was filled with pro-prohibition pieces, and it was time to unleash the Snallygaster to take on another social evil in their eyes. Well, no, that's an excellent question that you're asking, and that's why I was talking about the real benefit of reading these stories in context of a newspaper, like in the layout of the paper itself. So you get to see all the surrounding peripheral articles and issues that were going on at the time. I think once these weird stories get isolated, reprinted, archived, put into a book form, all that stuff kind of gets lost. And you just kind of distill it down to this, creature. So who knows? I mean, I haven't really researched these other myths, other legends, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them are rooted in these social issues of the time, especially ones that came about during turn of the century when these hoax stories were still really prevalent. Well, but you're absolutely right. And in a way, for the story, I think, to survive and endure, it almost has to become isolated from these instances because, first of all, there's just lots of ugly racial connotations, like in the case of 1909. And when I came across that stuff, I didn't know I was going to come across it when I was writing the book. And there was to be honest, there was a part of me that said, "Oh, I don't know how to fit this into the tone of the book I was writing. I was writing this book about this interesting creature, and this ugly stuff has come up, this racism, and I don't know how to deal with it." Well, I had to deal with it because it's part of history, and it's part of the Snallygaster's history. So I couldn't rightly ignore it because then I would be kind of whitewashing the Snallygaster myth and promoting it. Now, when I've given talks locally about the Snallygaster and those points come up, I can, some people sort of bristle at it as if I'm kind of making the Snallygaster less fun or taking something that they view as playful and innocent and associating it with something much darker. But it is what it is. Sure. So on July 8th, 1947, the Frederick News ran a story about a local man who had witnessed flying saucers traveling from the north and headed towards Washington, D.C. There were 5 flying saucers in formation, and the paper tried to tie the incident into the Snallygaster legend by basically saying, "We're not afraid of UFOs. We've dealt with Snallygasters." Now, I researched it, and 1947 was when the UFO sightings first started to begin. I'm not a UFO expert, but I'm sure some of your listeners will be much more familiar with the background here. But apparently there was a pilot who had, first reported flying saucer UFO in 1947, June of that year, I believe. I think it was that summer. And that's when the flying saucer UFO stories really started to take off. So there again, we have an example of a local paper kind of capitalizing on the UFO craze and folding in their own legend to make it kind of relevant. Sure. I didn't run across the information about, I never ran across the story connecting the Snallygaster to Senator Joseph McCarthy when I was doing my research. It was something that I came across later on, probably probably in the same sources that you have, on Wikipedia and such. So I don't have a whole lot to say about the connection between Senator McCarthy and the Snallygaster, except for that the word Snallygaster, which is a derivation of Snallygaster, is often used as a description of an unscrupulous politician. And it still occasionally will come up. So if you do a search for Snallygaster, a lot of the stuff that comes up are, references to a politician. So if a politician is acting without scruples, they are called as Snallygaster. And I don't know where that started. I don't know when that term was first published or who kind of ran with it, but there's always been this kind of connection between Snallygaster, and corrupt politicians, probably because of the Snallygaster's proximity to Washington, D.C., if I can take a guess. Sure. So Gordon Chaplin, he's a writer, and he was a staff writer at the Washington Post in the 1970s, and he wrote pieces for their Sunday magazine on travel and politics, and his stories often had a humorous bent. And he wrote Gordon Chaplin in 1976 published a story called the Grand Bicentennial Washington Post Potomac Expedition to Darkest Maryland in Search of the Mysterious Snallygaster. And it sort of reads like a cross between Joseph Conrad's Hearts of Darkness and a Wes Anderson movie. It's very absurd, kind of in the vein of Hunter S. Thompson's gonzo journalism. So again, you read the article in context, it's clearly some sort of satire. It's playful, it's fun, it's bizarre. No, I think it is misinterpreted as not being satire, probably quite often. Because as we were talking about before, most of these stories exist out of context eventually, right? So Gordon Chaplin just goes on a Snallygaster expedition in 1976, and it's funded by the Washington Post, and that becomes the story that most people read. It just becomes part of Snallygaster lore. So the idea that it was this satirical article, which is a great piece, I've read it in full, kind of gets lost, I think. But maybe that's not such a terrible thing. No. I had not heard anything of Gordon Chaplin coming back, with any kind of stories about the Snallygaster. Apparently, hundreds of people had volunteered for his expedition, and including bartenders, taxi drivers, atomic scientists, even some politicians. And he narrowed it down to what he considered to be the 5 most qualified people in the world. And these people were Dick Swanson, who was a Life magazine photographer who had covered the Vietnam War for 6 years, and he was in charge of defense and pharmaceuticals. And then there was a husband and wife team called the Lockettes, and they were in charge of logistics. And then there was Ginny Duran. She was a filmmaker who documented the lives of prostitutes. And then there was Gordon's wife, Helen, who had practiced homeopathic medicine, and she served the role of psychic healer. So it was all very sort of 1970s. And you read the article in context, and there's elements of the Watergate scandal and New Age religion and gonzo journalism. And it's all kind of meshed together into this, fun, absurd article. I can't tell if Chaplin was into that stuff or not. He may have been making fun of or sort of poking fun at that what was going on at the time, and there was a lot of this kind of new age stuff. So there's a good chance that he was actually poking fun at that instead of really being a part of it. I do know that he was an environmentalist, and he wrote a lot about environmental issues, and some of those details creep into his Snallygaster expedition story, where folks are concerned that killing the Snallygaster is going to disrupt the ecosystem and so forth. Sure. So I think what makes the Snallygaster so adaptable is you can see him through all kinds of different lenses, through folklore, through socio-political commentary, cryptozoology. That seems to be the strongest draw for a lot of people. I actually have a funny story about that. So a couple of years ago, I get this call out of the blue from this producer out in Los Angeles, and he says, "Well, are you the Snallygaster writer?" And I said, "Yeah, I wrote this book about Snallygaster. I'd love to talk to you about it." "Okay, because we want to do this documentary series on the Snallygaster." "Okay." And he told me who he was with, and I won't name the channel, but he mentioned that he was going to he was going to make this very serious documentary about the Snallygaster. And so he starts asking me all these questions about the Snallygaster, and I'm giving him all the information I've given you about African American voter suppression and prohibition and Dutch Pennsylvania folklore and mythology. And I'm going on, and I'm probably, talking for 20 minutes straight. And I'm imagining, he's going to have me on as like Snallygaster expert, and I'm going to be the guy like in front of a row of books, and and then he pauses and he goes, "Well, have you ever seen it?" And I just sort of went crestfallen, and I knew right then I knew where it was going. And I went, no, sir, I have not seen it. I'm sorry. And he goes, Do you know anyone that's seen it? And I said, no, sir, I can't think of anyone. I don't know. I'm sure you can go out there and find them. I'm sure they're out there. "Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Like, we'll be in touch." I never heard from him. So then, 6 months later, something, a buddy of mine gives me a call. He goes, "You got to turn on the TV. They got your Snallygaster on there." And I turn it on, and it's the show. And it's these guys out in the woods, making Snallygaster calls, hunting it down, all very, very serious, and, night vision cameras and the whole thing. And so, the lesson learned, I missed my 15 minutes, and if I had only told them I had seen the Snallygaster and I was willing to traipse to the woods in the middle of the night to go find it. But accurate. Very funny. It's very funny indeed. It was hilarious. I did enjoy the show. It was very entertaining. It was a lot of fun. And I am all for, Snallygaster in the spotlight, But I mention that because, the cryptozoological element is definitely the thing that appeals to most people. That's definitely where we are right now, sort of in the zeitgeist. And when I talk about the other stuff, I got to be honest, I kind of lose some folks, but that's okay. That's all right. Because, there's always somebody out there willing to go out there with a Snallygaster whistle and do the Snallygaster calls and, set traps and so forth. Well, I don't know if you can see the Snallygaster in the future, but there is the Snallygaster Beer Festival, which is coming back to DC on October 12th. It's been going on for a few years now. I've always meant to go, haven't been, but they have a series of local breweries, and people bring beers and they drink, and there's a commemorative Snallygaster mug. So that started a couple years ago. The Snallygaster Beer Festival. It's very popular. Apparently it attracts a lot of folks. But in all seriousness, as far as the Snallygaster coming back, that's a really good question. We are in really turbulent times. It's hard to say. If the Snallygaster comes back, it's virally somehow, it's probably not going to be the Snallygaster that we recognize, from 1909 or even 1932 or even 1976, where the Snallygaster had already taken on more of kind of a Bigfoot look. I think the Snallygaster changes with the times, and it would probably be, something that we're not all that familiar with. But you see these myths and legends emerging to speak to, modern anxieties, fears. We have an 8-year-old in grammar school, and we got an email last year, sort of hysterical email that, there was this thing on YouTube that was like, trying to get your kid to like hurt themselves. And, it was all a hoax, none of it was real. But what it was a reflection of parental anxiety about technology and about losing your kids to YouTube, and all these sort of very real concerns. So it's incredible how these urban legends and these stories, mythologies will always kind of emerge to speak to modern anxieties. Well, so for me, the appeal to the Snallygaster has always been its kind of idiosyncratic regional weirdness. It'd be really hard to kind of export the Snallygaster out of this region without kind of losing its uniqueness, and it would probably just sort of become kind of a generic dragon or something. Not that there's anything wrong with dragons, but it wouldn't be the Snallygaster. If you took the Snallygaster and removed it from this region of Maryland and its history, it would be something very different. So that's always been the appeal to me. It's something that kind of resists being commodified, and everything seems to be kind of commodified now. So it's pretty strange. It's pretty strange that would take that. At the same time, somebody out there with no connection to the area, may take the Snallygaster and do something, unique and cool with it, and that's cool too. I'm never say never, right? I'm not sure if I have enough material to write another book about the Snallygaster. The kids' book was a lot of fun. Wasn't terribly successful, to be honest. I mean, what I was trying to do with it was I was trying to kind of scratch that cryptozoological itch that a lot of kids have that really wasn't present in the first book. So I'd go to these, I'd go do readings at schools or libraries in the area, and realized that the material, the way I presented it, needed to be kind of modified to capture the attention of children. So I thought, well, I'll take, these young kids, and I'll put them at the center of the story and have them kind of search out the Snallygaster. So that was kind of my attempt of what I was trying to do there. Another reason I wanted to do that was the region has changed quite a bit. So you have a lot of kids that live here that did not grow up in the area, whose parents didn't even grow up in the area. It's become much more of a community, than it was even, 30 years ago. So you get a lot of folks that live out here that take the big long commute into DC. So you've got these, professionals out here, and their kids have never heard stories of the Snallygaster because they didn't grow up hearing them from their grandparents. So I wanted to find a way to continue the legacy of the Snallygaster in an honorable way. So for a new generation to, show some interest in it. And that's really my goal. If I sell a few books, that's cool, but my legacy hopefully will be that, there's a book about the Snallygaster sitting on the bookshelves of the local libraries, and that future generations may stumble across it and realize that they've got a, monster in their own backyard. Okay, so both of my Snallygaster books, Snallygaster, The Lost Legend of Frederick County, and Beware the Snallygaster, are available for purchase on Amazon. I would just encourage, I'd just like to kind of encourage folks that are listening to your podcast to seek out the weird myths and legends of their own communities, because who knows, maybe, they'll end up writing a book on an obscure local legend. There's a lot of local legends that are more popular, more well-known, but a lot of folks would be surprised. There are stories in every town in America, large and small, mythical creatures, ghost stories. I'm sure you'll cover a lot of them in your podcast series. So I would encourage folks to go beyond the internet and go to the local libraries and go do research and find out what's out there.
Tell us about your favorite local legend on our Twitter and Instagram at @strange_phenom and on our Facebook at Strange Phenomenon, all one word. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. Visit www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk. Additional music provided by Sergey Cheremisinov.